The company that paid Apple billions of dollars to keep every competitor out of the iPhone was fined nearly 1 billion euros by Europe. That was January 2018. By June 2022, every cent of that fine had been erased. Not because the company was innocent, but because the investigators broke their own rules. The company is Qualcomm, and for most of the last decade they made the chip inside almost every smartphone on Earth that connects you to a cellular network. Think of it as the tiny radio that lets your phone talk to cell towers, download videos, send messages, and do everything that makes a smartphone smart. Without that chip, your phone is an expensive brick, and Qualcomm controlled roughly 65% of the global market for these chips during the period that matters most. They weren't just dominant, they were so far ahead of every competitor that the gap barely looked like a race at all. I explain EU corporate cases like this every week. Subscribe to see the next one. 5 years before the billion-euro fine, Qualcomm held a very different kind of power. In 2011, they signed a deal with Apple, and the details of that deal would eventually reach the highest courts in Europe. The terms were straightforward but extraordinary. Qualcomm would pay Apple billions of dollars over 5 years, and in return, Apple would use only Qualcomm chips in every iPhone and every iPad it produced. Not most of them, every single one. The contract included a clawback provision that made switching almost unthinkable. If Apple ever put a competitor's chip in a single device, the payments would stop, and Apple would have to return a large portion of what it had already received in previous years. The financial penalty for disloyalty was so severe that it functioned as a lock. Apple's chief operating officer Jeff Williams later described the arrangement in blunt terms. He said they were staring at an increase of over $1 billion per year in licensing fees, so they had a gun to their head. Apple accepted exclusivity because the alternative was a massive cost increase that would have hit every iPhone sold worldwide. The result was simple and devastating for anyone trying to compete. Intel had spent billions of dollars developing phone chips specifically because they wanted Apple's business badly. Internal Apple documents confirmed that engineers seriously considered switching to Intel on multiple occasions throughout the 5-year period, but Qualcomm's payments made the math impossible. No rival could offer Apple a deal generous enough to offset the billions Qualcomm was paying them to stay exclusive. For 5 years, from 2011 through 2016, the door to the world's most important smartphone customer remained completely shut. And this wasn't just about Apple losing a better price. Every other phone manufacturer watched Apple's supplier choices when making their own decisions. If Intel couldn't win Apple, smaller brands saw no reason to take a risk on Intel either. The exclusivity rippled outward across the entire market. But there was a second front to this war, and it involved a much smaller target. In 2009, a small startup called Icera was operating out of modest offices in Bristol, England. They employed a small team of engineers who had built something impressive: chips for the previous generation of mobile networks, the ones that carried data before smartphones became truly fast. The company was young, underfunded compared to Qualcomm, and fighting for every contract it could win. And by most technical measures, Icera's chips were genuinely competitive. They were winning real contracts with Huawei and ZTE, two of the world's largest phone manufacturers at the time, beating Qualcomm on performance in head-to-head tests. Qualcomm noticed. Internal emails from this period would later become the most damaging evidence in the entire case. One message discussed how Qualcomm should not give Icera any opportunity at Huawei strategically. Another was even more direct. 2 words that would be read aloud in a European courtroom years later: crush Icera at ZTE. What Qualcomm did next was targeted and precise. They offered their own chips to Huawei and ZTE at prices below what it actually cost to make them. Not across the board, and not to every customer, only to the 2 companies where Icera was gaining ground. This meant Qualcomm absorbed losses on a tiny fraction of its total business while starving Icera of the exact contracts it needed to grow and survive. If you've ever wondered why your phone choices seem so limited, why the same few companies make every chip inside every device, this is part of the reason. A startup with limited funding cannot survive when a company with 60% market share decides to sell below cost at precisely the accounts where the startup is winning. The economics are impossible to overcome. NVIDIA bought Icera in 2011 for $367 million. Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's chief executive, believed the technology was worth saving. He planned to combine Icera's radio chips with NVIDIA's processors to create a complete mobile platform that could challenge Qualcomm head-to-head. But the damage from years of below-cost competition was already done. Icera never recovered the momentum it had lost at Huawei and ZTE. By 2015, NVIDIA shut the division down entirely. The company Qualcomm had targeted was already fatally wounded before NVIDIA even wrote the check. But while Icera was dying, someone had already sounded the alarm. Back in June of 2009, Icera's chief executive Stan Boland had walked into the European Commission's offices in Brussels and filed a formal complaint. He alleged that Qualcomm was deliberately destroying his company through predatory pricing. That single filing triggered what would become the largest semiconductor investigation in European history. Commission investigators spent years collecting hundreds of internal emails, opening boxes of financial records, pulling pricing data, and taking testimony from Apple executives. They built a case on two separate fronts simultaneously: the Apple exclusivity arrangement and the predatory pricing against Icera. On January 24, 2018, Commissioner Margrethe Vestager stood at a podium in Brussels and announced a fine of €997 million. Qualcomm paid billions of dollars to Apple so that it would not buy from rivals, she told the room. These payments were not just reductions in price, they were made on the condition that Apple would exclusively use Qualcomm chips in all its iPhones and all its iPads. She called it illegal under EU antitrust rules. A year and a half later, in July 2019, a second fine arrived, €242 million, for the predatory pricing that destroyed Icera. The internal emails were cited directly. The below-cost pricing was documented quarter by quarter. But the largest semiconductor fine in European history lasted exactly 4 years. In June 2022, the EU General Court annulled the entire €997 million fine. The ruling was unanimous and comprehensive, and it had nothing to do with whether the exclusivity deal actually happened. Nobody disputed the payments or the contract. The court found something else entirely. Commission investigators had held 7 secret meetings with 6 different companies during the investigation, walking into offices across Europe and gathering information without ever telling Qualcomm these meetings took place. No proper notes survived from those rooms, and Qualcomm was never given the chance to respond to whatever evidence or arguments emerged from those private conversations. The court called it multiple failures to observe due process. The commission did not lose because it was wrong about the deal. It lost because of what its own investigators did in secret. The procedural failure was so clear that the commission chose not to appeal the ruling to a higher court. The case was simply over, and the European Union was ordered to pay a portion of Qualcomm's legal fees. But the predatory pricing fine, the one connected to Icera and those internal emails, survived on completely separate grounds. In September 2024, the General Court confirmed €238.7 million against Qualcomm for selling chips below cost to eliminate a competitor. The emails proved intent. The pricing data proved execution. And unlike the exclusivity case, this investigation had followed proper procedure from start to finish. Qualcomm still dominates. No structural remedy was ever imposed to change the shape of the market. No competitor was restored to the position it lost during those critical years. Icera is gone forever. Intel eventually gave up on phone chips entirely. The company remains the world's leading supplier of the chips that connect smartphones to cellular networks. Their market position today looks almost identical to what it looked like before either fine was ever announced. The case did change European competition law in lasting ways. New draft guidelines published in 2024, printed and distributed to every competition authority in Europe, now require regulators to prove actual competitive harm with detailed economic analysis rather than assuming exclusivity deals are automatically illegal. Stricter procedural rules force the Commission to disclose all third-party meetings and maintain written records throughout every investigation. These reforms exist because of what went wrong in the Qualcomm case. Apple eventually sued Qualcomm in 2017 over licensing fees, then settled 2 years later when it became clear Apple still needed Qualcomm's technology for the next generation of wireless networks. Apple bought Intel's entire modem division for $1 billion in 2019, hiring thousands of engineers and trying to build its own chip so it would never depend on Qualcomm again. That effort is still underway years later, and Apple still buys Qualcomm chips while it tries. Next time you pick up your phone and open an app, the chip connecting you to the network was almost certainly designed by the same company that paid billions to ensure no rival ever got the chance to offer you something better. Vestager said no competitor could effectively challenge Qualcomm in this market, no matter how good their products were. She said that in 2018, it remains true today.